Alright, good afternoon class. So we have here some of the math problems. After our tutorials today with about 5 people, we were able to get quite a bit done. I'm going to go ahead and do number 29, letter A with you guys. So go ahead, get your worksheets out. 29, letter A. Question number 29 asks, which of the following 5 countries will have the greatest population after 100 years? And it tells us to assume that population growth rate will remain the same. So the first country that we're going to deal with is Madagascar, and it has 15 million people, and it says that it has a growth rate of 3%. One thing that we addressed in the tutorials is scientific notation. Okay, I'm going to use scientific notation in this brief tutorial video to kind of make everything a little bit shorthand. And if you don't remember what scientific notation looks like, it kind of looks like this. So it's going to be 15 million, so million can be represented as 10 to the 6th. So 15 times 10 to the 6 million people at 3% growth. Okay, so the first step of the problem is to kind of conceptualize this. What does it mean to have 3% growth? Well, it means that from one year to another year, you're going to have 3% more people than what you had before. So, if we were to do like a side example, I want you guys to consider just a population, and let's make it nice and easy, a population of 100 million. So we have 100 million people in this population. So 100 times 10 to the 6th. And what does it mean that it's going to have a 3% growth rate? Well, that 3%, so 3% of 100, 3% is going to equal 3 times 10 to the 6th, right? Or 3 million people. And so that means from one year you had 100 million people, and then the next year you're going to add 3 million people on top of that. So after that year of 3% growth, you're going to have 103 million people, or 103 times 10 to the 6th. So that's a nice little easy example with 100 million people. Now I want you guys to try to figure out, how are you going to do that for 15 million people? Now 15 isn't so bad, okay? So we could write out 15 times 10 to the 6th million people, okay? 15 million people. And we're going to try to find out what's 3% of that, right? But there's an added clause to this whole problem, which is we're trying to figure it out after 100 years. So let's rewind a little bit. Sorry, I don't want to confuse you guys. Let's go back to that example of 100 million people. So our operation here is we took 100 million people, we found out what's 3% of that, and then we added it back to the 100 million people to get 103 million people, right? So another way to write that would be 100 million people, 100 times 10 to the 6th, or 100 power 6, right? And we multiplied it by itself, and we added 3%. And 3% is the same thing as saying 3 100ths, right? 3%, 3 100ths. And then we have to multiply it by the number of years, which is going to be 100 years. So here, we didn't have to multiply it by 100 because we just did it from one year to another. So it's just after 1 year. If we were to do this, okay, if we were to do this instead, we would write 100 times 10 raised to the 6th. And what's 1 plus 0.03 times 100? Well, I went ahead and distributed out the 100 to each of those. So I got 100 plus what's 100 times 300ths? That's just going to be 3, okay? And this is going to be equal, if you distribute out this as well, what's 100 times 100? Well, it's going to be 10,000 plus What's 100 times 3? That's easy. That's going to be 300. And this is all in parentheses because we don't want to forget that we're multiplying by a million, or times 10 to the 6th. Okay? So 10,000 plus 300 times 10 to the 6th. And this is going to equal 10300, right? 10,300 times 10 to the 6th, which is kind of the way Diamond really likes to write it. But let's go ahead and fix that so that it's not this weird 10,300 times 10 to the 6th or 10,000 million, right? We could write it as 10.3 times 10 to the 9th. And if we're doing times 10 to the 9th, we're already at 1 billion. So all of these are equal to each other. So we could say 10.3 billion people. So if we had an initial population of 100 million people at a 3% growth rate, after 100 years, we could expect 10.3 billion people. Okay. So that would be our little side example. Now we could go ahead and go back to Madagascar. Let's go back to Madagascar. And we see that it's 15 million people at a 3% growth rate. So we're going to kind of follow the same setup that we had before. Okay? But instead of 100 times 10 to the 6th, we're going to have 15 times 10 to the 6th times 1 by itself, right? Times the 3% growth rate, so that didn't change at all, times 100 years. Okay. So if we go ahead and distribute out the 100 first, which I think in this case would be easier, go ahead and distribute that out and try to figure out what you're going to get. It doesn't change much like before, right? It's just times, or 15 million times 100 plus 3. And now we can multiply that 15 out. So I want you guys to multiply that 15 out. So 15 times 100, that's going to be 1,500. And 15 times 3, that's going to be 45. And we don't want to forget that we're multiplying by a million, which is the same thing as multiplying times 10 to the 6th power, right? So we should have that. And then after that, we get 1,545 times 10 to the 6th, which is the same thing as saying 1.545 times 10 to the 9th. So in Madagascar, when we started out with 15 million people, and we had 3% growth rate, after 100 years, so after a whole century, we now have 1.5 billion people. Okay? So that's 1.5 billion people. And at this point, I'm going to highlight my answer. You guys are going to either highlight it or box it. Remember, you guys are writing this out. I'm typing this out. And that kind of gives us our answer for part A. Okay? Now, if we go back to the original question, it's trying to figure out which of these countries will have the largest. So is it going to be A, Madagascar? Is it going to be B, Colombia? Is it going to be C, Sudan? Is it going to be D, France? Or is it going to be E, Ivory Coast? I don't know why they have it in French. Ivory Coast. Okay? So these 5 countries, which one is going to have the largest population after a century? Well, we already figured out what Madagascar's population is going to be after a century. And that was at a 3% growth rate. We see Colombia has a 2% growth rate, and its initial population is 40 million. We see that Sudan, like Madagascar, has a 3% growth rate, but it starts off with 30 million people, so twice as much. We see that France only has a 0.3% growth rate, okay, but it has the largest initial population. And we see that the Ivory Coast has 3% growth rate, and it has 15 million people. Okay. So I want you guys to try to figure out C, D, and E, and also try to make some predictions, okay? Try to make some predictions. But let's go ahead and work on B together. I want to make sure that you guys have 2 examples. So Colombia has 40 million at 2% growth rate. So let's go ahead and kind of follow the same pattern that we had up here. So we start off with 40 million people, which is 40 times 10 to the 6th. We're going to multiply that by itself, right? Because it's a population times the percentage growth added to the original population. So in this case, we're going at 0.2, okay? We're still multiplying by 100 years. And if we go ahead and do this, we're going to find out that it's not much different from before. We have 40 times 10 to the 6th. And if we distribute out the 100 first, we get 100 plus 2. If you don't understand how I'm getting the plus 2, the 2 zeros right here tell you to shift over when you're multiplying 2 decimal places to the right. So instead of 2 hundredths times 100 would give you 2. Okay. After that, we could go ahead and distribute out the 40. So let's go do that. 4,000 now, right? Plus 80 times our million, so times 10 to the 6th, which is equal to 4,080 times 10 to the 6th, which is the same thing as saying 4.08 billion people. So 4.0 times 10 to the 9th. Now, I'm writing in both scientific notation and writing out 4.08 billion and actually writing out billion. And that's to kind of get you guys more familiar with this. 10 to the 9th is a billion, 10 to the 6th is a million, okay? So you should be fairly comfortable with those, okay? Again, I asked you guys to do C, D, and E. Now, real quick with D, since it's going to be 0.3%, I'm going to go ahead and set you guys up with the problem. So this is letter D for France, right? So we do 60 million, so 60 times 10 to the 6th, times 1 plus 0.0, and instead of saying 0.3, since it's going to be 0.3%, it's going to be 0.03. I want you guys to think about that for a second and see why that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense to you, make sure to ask one of your classmates. Make sure to ask me at the beginning of class, okay? And that's still going to be 100 years. And then you just kind of carry out your problem like you did before. So again, you're responsible for C, D, and E, and we've already done A. Madagascar after a century is going to have 1.5 billion people, while Colombia after a century is going to have 4.08 billion people. I want you guys to figure out C, D, and E and the rest of the homework as well. Okay? If you guys have any questions about specific homework problems, make sure to get together as a group and try to tackle them. And then also feel free to ask me via email. Okay? I don't know if I will be able to respond to you guys by Thursday at class, but you could always shoot me an email if you'd like. Alright, best of luck, guys.